the end of Hellhammer and especially Celtic Frost was when we became our own band. We wanted to define our own music with Celtic Frost. We felt we had to distance ourselves. Hellhammer was not the myth it is nowadays. It was a huge stumbling block for ourselves. On a personal level, we wanted to attain more quality as musicians. We had basically just begun to play. We wanted to become better musicians, and we felt in Hellhammer we didn't fully accomplish that. And on a business level, Hellhammer was ripped apart. The Hellhammer's EPs and demos were ripped apart in the press at the time. Also by the record companies, by most of the fans. There was only a very small circle of people that dug our music at the time. And when we formed Celtic Frost to give our music a much larger concept, Hellhammer proved to be a huge stumbling block. And of course that made us turn against our own work for a while, because we felt it hindered our advance.
And when we formed Celtic Frost, we didn't only say like, let's form a new band. We knew from the get-go that this would be a completely different entity, you know. We started to work out a concept. We developed this vision for what Celtic Frost was to become. We didn't only say like, okay, let's do something else, you know. We came up with the idea, the concept for the name, the ideas for the first 3 albums, including the titles, Morbid Tales, To Megatherion, Into the Pandemonium. We knew what the artwork was going to be, in what direction. We already had the rights by H.R. Giger, you know, mind you, to use his artwork for one of the covers with Hellhammer. We deliberately didn't do that because we thought the music wasn't ready for the artwork. We thought his artwork was so were such masterpieces, was such genius, that our abysmal music just didn't really suit it. So we wanted to come up with something, and we didn't even plan on using it for the first record, for Morbid Tales. We knew that this would be for To Megatherion, for the second record. The first one, the first sleeve, the first record was there to establish the band, you know, to establish the music, and then give more depth to it with, of course, To Megatherion. And these were already things that we did when we started working with Celtic Frost, you know.
We liked the extremity of Hellhammer, but Hellhammer was the end of it. Hellhammer was just about extremity. And we wanted to incorporate so much more on top of that, musically, visually. We just didn't want to have any limits. We didn't want to be tied to any unwritten heavy metal laws. And this is why we took what we loved in Hellhammer, which was the heavy metal root of it all, and built such a huge concept on top of it, which was Celtic Frost. And as Martin said, we made this booklet at that time, before home computers and internet. We did this on a typewriter and glued like pictures and everything. We literally gave them an idea of what the album covers would be, what our image would be with each album, what the songs would be about. It was totally detailed. It was insanely detailed, and I mean, the record company probably never saw anything like that.
If you look at the history of Hellhammer, there's one name that has lasted throughout, and that was Tom G. Warrior, you know, because he had the will, he had the determination. And then I think when I came into the game, there was the second part, you know, that started working this project into a band, into a unit, you know. And we were looking for somebody else to join in. We just didn't have anybody at the time that was really, you know.
It was a miracle we found each other in that world that they just described. And to find a third guy was close to impossible.
You know, most of the guys at that time, they wanted to get laid, they wanted to smoke dope, drink some beer on the weekend, party, hang out, the usual thing that you want to do when you're like somewhere between 13 and 18, you know.
Well, and if they played music, they wanted to emulate AC/DC, which at that time was the biggest metal band. I mean, the big thing in Switzerland was to sound like AC/DC, which of course Crocus perfected, but there was a million other bands. And if you came with that music, before the advent of extreme metal, if you came with the music that we played, they were just like, no fucking way.
This was our life. With the other guys, they put a lot of times they put a guitar around their neck and boom, I am Yngwie Malmsteen. Boom, I'm whoever, I'm Richie Blackmore, whoever is big right now. They were just acting it out. And if you listen to the music, you know, if you look at what time frame we're talking about, you realize that we were working hard. I mean, we recorded Apocalyptic Raids and Morbid Tales in the same year. We're talking about 84 for both records.
It was like we didn't have a year.
Yeah. I mean, and there's a giant jump, I would say, between both those records, you know, in quality of the writing of the music, in the execution of the production. You know, we didn't have any clue with Apocalyptic Raids, and we worked our asses off to exactly get what we want with Morbid Tales when we entered the studio.
I think an important part, if we talk about this, is the desperation that Martin hinted at before. We had labored in a vet rehearsal room for like 2 years to get this record deal, and we never expected to get one, but then we got one, and it was to us, this was the holy thing. It was, and we didn't want to lose the record deal. We knew Hellhammer needed to be improved upon massively. We needed to change everything. We needed to become a different band, a better band. But how to sell that to the record company? There was such desperation, such fear to be thrown back to being nobodies without a record deal. That's why we labored so hard on this. We knew we had this one chance, and it wasn't even a given. We had to sell this to the record company. We had to sound much better. We had made this huge concept, but we also had to accomplish what we wrote down. So that's why we practiced like a professional band, even though we were little kids that had just attained a record deal, and we were nobodies. Nobody knew us. There was, our music didn't have scene, but we were there insanely professional for that time. And most of that we only realized later how far ahead we were of ourselves. There's two main influences from the time of Morbid Tales. One is the new wave of British heavy metal, which at that time was the revolution in heavy metal. And I think, visually speaking, which had a huge impact on our work, it was probably the work of H.R. Giger, who at that time we approached.
We felt a close kinship to his kind of work, because he was basically the only artist in the country that was, in our viewpoint, as extreme as we were, in approaching artistic expression.
His art expressed exactly what we were trying to express. We looked at his paintings and his sketches and everything. We found ourselves in that, and we were struggling to do the same with our music. And of course, like Martin says, we looked at him as a genius far above us, but we were like, this is exactly what we want to do musically.
It's really hard to pinpoint it down, because we were just like bursting with ideas and visions, we were inspired by the writings of Robert E. Howard, H.P. Lovecraft, Eliphas Levi, Aleister Crowley. All of that is already worked in, into the lyrics of Morbid Tales, and of course a lot of it we started already to elaborate on with Hellhammer, in the early days prior to Celtic Frost. Prior to Morbid Tales, you can see the inspiration of Crowleyan magic, in the heptagram on the front cover of Morbid Tales, there were so many inspirations. There were so many, so like you might say, influences already outside of the music world at that time, The Omen score was a big one, very much so. The Goblin scores for the Dario Argento movies, and this is also where some of these ideas, for like Danse Macabre and the intro, Human, and the pieces that we worked into some of the songs like Nocturnal Fear, came about. You couldn't go to a record store, and go like, oh, have you got the latest Iron Maiden record? They would have been like, Iron who? That was at a time when like the first two Iron Maiden records came out, and nobody heard of Iron Maiden in Switzerland at the time. It was starting to spread. There were no specialized magazines, no specialized radio programs. You didn't have MTV or any other music television station. You had like the charts, the Swiss charts once a week, on the radio. That was the only popular music you got on a regular basis. There was no internet. There was nothing like that. If you wanted to have information on the occult or Satanism, or anything like that, you had to go to a public library. Specialized bookstores, there were like one or two in Zurich, Switzerland, specialized in religion and spiritualism, and if you would go there, kid, black leather jacket, something like this, what you got on Satanism, those people looked at you like you're the devil yourself, you could have been glad if they didn't call the police. Nowadays, you can become instant evil in 5 seconds, It's true, you go into the internet, like, okay,
doesn't take any effort anymore.
It really, and then you go to Hot Topic, what's the evil clothing season, this, where this season right now, in this country, it's the same world all over.
Nowadays, you can just join a scene. Like he says, you go to Hot Topic, half an hour later you're the perfect goth or metal guy. Back then you had to actually accomplish it. You had to be part of an underground scene, you had to be part of the tape traders, you had to know these people. You had to first find out. I had to first find out that there's a fan scene from California called the Headbanger, in which all the hot bands were featured that nobody knew. I had to find out about that through like a million tape traders that wrote to each other. Letters would take like 10 days from America to Switzerland. Everything was slower. You had to accomplish something. You had to create the cult. It wasn't just like, you know, you go on the internet, what do I want to be? You know, read up on Wikipedia what you want to be and how it's done. Writing Morbid Tales was starting in June '84, which means I was 19, and I turned 20 while we were working on this album. We recorded it, I think, in September or October, and I had my birthday in July. So while we were doing this, I turned 20. Martin is 4 years younger than me. I think.
I was 16 and turned 17. We were all kids from like rural, suburban Philistine, Zurich, Switzerland, you know, not rock and roll world, you know. You know, our record company back then worked like many small-time record companies work. Get some like cheap studio with some engineer and get all your bands recording in the same studio so you get the better rate.
We recorded, mixed, and mastered in 6 days, yeah. Nowadays, I have no idea how we accomplished that, but the thing is, this is one of our best records ever.
I think we were lucky enough that Horst Müller, you know, the engineer, was taking it serious, you know, and was into it and was into the experimenting as well and enjoyed it as well because he was instrumental in getting this done, you know.
Very much so.
Because for Human to get this kind of like scream done, you know, that was kind of like work back in the day. You couldn't just sample something and then edit it and make a loop out of it. You had to do a tape loop, you know, to get it done. So you first had to record something.
Our drummer literally sat there with a pencil holding the reel.
The reel while it was tape. Because we had to have a loop that was, you know, because the short loops always had this like, so we had to have a longer loop, you know, and therefore the tape machine was not long enough to get that length so it wouldn't sound inhuman.
I mean, it's ridiculous. I mean, the whole thing, we were so poor at the time, we couldn't afford guitar picks and strings. And of course, we couldn't afford cameras. So any photos that survive from the time, and there's like maybe like 2, or were like taken by either the engineer or like the guys who called themselves our road crew. And there's just hardly any documentation. We were poor. This whole thing was on a shoestring, you know.
At that time, I was still struggling to find a proper bass because I'm left-handed. You know, I'm a lefty, so which means I'm cursed as a musician. Being left-handed means doom, especially if you live in a country like Switzerland, where there's like no left-handed instruments whatsoever, and especially when you play the bass. You know, I mean, you might find some guitar. You know,
the Marshall JCM 800 100-watt head. With just standard Marshall cabinets and tube screamer, everything on full, and an Iceman. It was exactly the same as I have now.
We already had to struggle to get a drummer who was professional enough to do the record. Because like professional drummers back in the day in Zurich, Switzerland weren't rock drummers. They were at best jazz drummers, you know, and they didn't want to have anything to do with rock. Nevertheless, heavy metal music.
To touch us, no.
And the only one, musically speaking, capable was Steve Priestley. Yeah. But he, you know, didn't dare to join in fully.
He was a fucking wimp. One of the most legendary albums of extreme metal had to be created by us, Martin and I, going on an afternoon talking to Steve Priestley's father, who sat there with a pipe in his rocking chair with sandals and said, I don't let my son record with a heavy metal band. We had to say, look, your son is very talented. Would you please let him go? It's just a few days. It's a chance of a lifetime for him. He's the only drummer we know. And we had to like convince him for hours. He said, okay, this album, allow him. This is how one of the legendary albums of extreme metal came about. But Morbid Tales is just, it was very lucky considering the budget, which must have been like $2 or something, and just the way everything came together, it was magic that the sound is like that. Going to Berlin and not being a band with like a huge budget meant we had to go either by train or by car, which meant crossing the border into communism, crossing the Iron Curtain like twice, going into East Germany and then into this little island that was West Berlin. And of course nowadays kids probably have no idea anymore what that's like. But there was actually a wall with barbed wire and watchtowers, almost like a concentration camp. And there was armed guards and Soviet tanks, and they would scrutinize your passports forever. And you knew you couldn't like joke around because those were like serious communists with like machine guns and everything. It was the real thing, like in some spy movie. And every time we wanted to go to a record company or to the studio, we had to cross that. And if you go to East Germany, it was like a different world. A lot of the streets weren't paved, and the buildings were in a really bad shape. It was really like being on a different planet. This scenery was very, very real to us. And of course it had an influence of our music and our thinking on this was the world we grew up in as kids. The world where your parents told you like every day there could be a nuclear war, like tomorrow.
World War III was a possibility back then. It was the hate of the Cold War.
Yeah.
It was exactly the opposite. It was people that you had those demonstrations, those peace demonstrations going on, peace walks. You had people holding hands, building human chains for like miles and miles between cities, you know, in fear of the oncoming onslaught, in fear of Armageddon, in fear of complete, total, utter annihilation. It was absolute paranoia. The U.S. was positioning Pershings throughout Europe, you know, close to the Soviet, you know, kingdom, to the Soviet empire. You know, they were threatening to retaliate. You know, this was really, I mean, this was the inspiration we got. You know?
It was the time of the Reagan administration and SDI, and it was by no means the end. Nobody knew that the end of the Cold War would happen in the 80s. A lot of our confidence was basically acted when we came into that studio. We knew this guy had worked with like platinum bands, like some years earlier, and of course. We acted like we knew what we were doing, and in reality, I was always shaking inside. I mean, when I took the guitar and I had to start my written guitar recordings in front of this guy, I was like, you know, I hope I'm not going to totally embarrass myself. I hope I can cut it. And you know, I was miserable as a lead guitar player, but of course we couldn't find anybody, so I had to play all the leads, and I was ashamed. But of course, I tried to not show that. Our confidence was in our approach was huge, but a lot of it was just a survival mode. We were just totally elated to be given that chance, to have a chance to be part of what we loved, namely the recording heavy metal scene. We had looked up to all these bands, and you know, to be a part of that, to be given the chance to be part of that was amazing. During my youth in the 70s, I had seen on Swiss television, I had seen a concert by Arthur Brown, who wore this totally radical corpse paint, which of course at that time wasn't called corpse paint. It was him too. He was just using theatrical makeup, and that always stuck in my mind. And then later on, I saw Alice Cooper, and some of our contemporaries must have drawn the same conclusions, like King Diamond or Slayer used a similar kind of makeup. And I was just totally fascinated by how extreme that made you look. It totally combined itself with the music that we were playing for me.
That's right. I guess, you know, the image was also kind of like exposing the hideousness, you know, that we felt within ourselves towards the outside. In one way, of course, we were trying to do to become the superhuman, the Nietzschean superhuman being, you know, trying to, creating these characters that were larger than life. But on the other hand, we also, of course, felt like this vulnerability, this kind of like failure in what we did. We just had failed with Apocalyptic Raids, with the record we had done before, you know, to ourselves. We realized that we were like abysmal musicians, you know, and I had like a pickle face, you know, pimple face, pickles would be in German. Pimples in my face all over. No girl would look at me, you know. I wasn't the handsome, like, what do you call it in the States, like quarterback, you know, blah blah blah, from the sports team. I was
Jock.
you know, the guy that was always left out, you know, because, well, you know, he's kind of like weird, you know. So I was trying to express the way I felt within myself, you know, to bring out that kind of like monster. And of course, that was also the time when you had, you know, the rise of the splatter movie. You know, when you had Dawn of the Dead, of course, when you had all the European zombie movies and all like that. And those were the creatures I could relate to, you know. This is how I wanted society to feel about me. I wanted to be a threat. And of course, the entire punk thing that was kind of like extreme aesthetics didn't apply. Again, like I just pointed out before, you know, we wanted our own world.
Another world in which I felt totally happy because he kept away all the people I hated, the people that made my life hell, as far as I perceived it. And the more extreme our music was, the more extreme we looked. It kept them at bay. It created our own world in which they had nothing to do, in which they didn't want to enter. That was just perfect for me. The more extreme, the more isolated we were. That's exactly what I wanted.
My first stage name, nom de plume, with Hellhammer, was Slate Necros. But we only decided on that. We actually did those names like sort of like together always. We only decided on that because we thought that first I wanted to go with Prowling Abortion. And we thought that like
Nice, right?
that's too radical. That's too extreme. But that's the way I felt.
It was starting to be called black metal, and it was a very controversial topic within the band too, whether we wanted to be labeled that or not.
When we started out as Hellhammer, to be frank, we were complete Venom acolytes. We were Venom clones, actually. Venom was the blueprint, or like a big part of the blueprint of where we wanted to go. When Venom came out with black metal, all of a sudden you had, this trend going on, and all of a sudden you had a lot of bands jumping on the bandwagon. You had Running Wild doing Adrian, Son of Satan, and all of a sudden, a lot of bands that didn't deal in the subject of Satanism or the occult had songs dealing, lyrics dealing with these subjects.
Bands like Halloween, which now would be called power metal, even touched upon that. And just the whole black metal thing was in a total definition phase, and we didn't really like the way it was going. We took the topic of occultism and religion very serious, but that didn't make us Satanists or a black metal band. We didn't like the way black metal was beginning to be perceived in the scene. So it was a major topic of conversation within Celtic Frost.
I mean, when you read Hellhammer lyrics, that's primitive, juvenile expression of teenage angst. This is, we want to fuck. Not only do we want to fuck, we want to fuck the world and God and everything in it. This was rebellion, teenage rebellion at its purest. But once we had gone through that phase, we realized, okay, but it's actually somewhere else where we want to go. And that was just the time when black metal started exploding, and all of a sudden Hellhammer became like a landmark, so to say. And we were like, no, this is not really where we want to be put at. We don't want to be stuck in some corner as some like Satan-loving virgin ravishers,
All of this was an attitude thing. It wasn't just like projecting some cheap image to be like big bad man with leather. It was really the aggression, the being evil, the frustration, the desperation. Everything was really in the music. It was part of the attitude, and I think you can hear that on Morbid Tales. It's when I look back, it's a miracle. We got not only like a metal album done, but all the effects and everything in that short time. It was all untried. It was all done the primitive way, not the time-saving way like you do it today.
Everything you hear on there is real, is analog. I mean, the violence and nocturnal fear are real. Everything that you hear in Danse Macabre was recorded analog. If it be some bell or some voices, every voice itself was recorded. Nowadays you can all do that with the computer. You can all do that, synthetically. And I think this is why the value of music, has diminished greatly.
In our own tiny world, yes, we thought we had something special for ourselves. We would have never been conceited enough to think that we were influencing anybody. Quite the opposite. We were happy that we had some room in the heavy metal scene in which we wanted to be so desperately. We didn't think we had an influence or anything like that. We were just happy we had gotten started with something, and to ourselves we did something special. But that was within our world. We didn't think like, yeah, we're special for the metal scene. It was just like Martin and I trying to get our ideas done the way we wanted them done. And I mean, we were kids. We had no self-confidence at that time. I mean, there's no way we could have foreseen or even had the faintest idea of that we were doing something that would like years later still be talked about.
I wouldn't change a bit. If I would be going back right now and would have to do it again, I think I wouldn't change a bit because it all felt right.